through the scale-up of antiretroviral treatment. And another target which we had, which was to reach 15 million people on antiretrovirals by the year 2015, has already been met. Most extraordinary. Many people, when that target came out, said there's no way you'll get 15 million people to take antiretrovirals every day in order to challenge HIV, and yet we've already done that. So a massive sense of achievement. And I want us to reflect briefly then on some of the science that's led into that. I don't have to go over Pontiano's slide again, because this is the slide that he showed from the MRC, showing the rise in life expectancy that antiretrovirals have brought in rural Uganda. There's a similar slide from the Africa Centre in rural KwaZulu-Natal. So I'm highlighting the role of the big, long-standing demographic research projects in various parts of southern, east, central, and indeed West Africa that have contributed to our understanding of what can be achieved with antiretrovirals in turning life expectancy around. And the World Bank has recently, well, not so recently now, but these are data from the World Bank, showing that the southern African countries with life expectancy dramatically falling and dramatically improving. HIV is exceptional. There are no other conditions that have changed life expectancy on this scale that we've been witness to in any of our lifetimes. When they publish the Global Burden of Diseases, they always have to abbreviate the changes in HIV because they would go right off the top of the scale on the bit of paper and the journal wouldn't be able to print them. So HIV is an extraordinary and exceptional condition. It's not only death from HIV that's fallen, we've seen tuberculosis falling promptly, and perhaps most excitingly, we've seen the impact that scaling up antiretroviral may be having on the transmission of HIV. So this is very interesting and exciting work from the Africa Centre that I hope some of you are aware of, and it combines various nice aspects of science that's being done. This is the geographical area in which the Africa Centre has its base, and these are time series showing in these examples the HIV prevalence, which started off low at less than 10% and gradually became worse and worse until there were areas of the country, of the sub-district, where the HIV prevalence was more than 40%. And then here is looking at the coverage of antiretroviral treatment in the same period, being scaled up as we go to the proportion of the population taking antiretrovirals. And what they showed was that if you lived within and you took the people within 3 kilometers of you, and you looked what proportion of them were taking antiretrovirals, the higher the proportion of people taking antiretrovirals around you, the lower your HIV incidence. And so this is ecological, but it's the first strong evidence at a population level that scaling up antiretrovirals really may be having an impact on the epidemiology of HIV. It's not completely straightforward. This is another study, again from an African cohort in Mombasa, of female sex workers in Mombasa. The black dots show the incidence from a horrendous 11 or 12% in 1998, falling gradually over time. And in red is the population, the overall population HIV prevalence, which is falling. And in green, the proportion of that population that is on antiretrovirals. And so you can see that as the proportion of people taking antiretrovirals grows, so the number of new cases in the sex workers falls. But of course you can also see that it was falling quite sharply before any antiretrovirals were given. So we shouldn't exaggerate the notion that the reason that HIV incidence is coming down is only because of antiretrovirals. And for that reason, there are large, ongoing community randomized studies, of which the largest is the POP-ART study in Zambia and South Africa, where 1 million people in 21 communities are being randomly allocated to different interventions, and at the community level, the HIV incidence is being measured in order to see what's being achieved. And I'd like to re-emphasize, which again various people have done, the importance of collaboration and of networks for big science. If you want to answer big, important questions, like whether or not antiretrovirals really can change the epidemiology of HIV, don't do it on your own in a little clinic somewhere. Form part of a collaborative network, build collaborations, because it takes big networks to answer big questions, and that's something that's come out once or twice in what we've seen. So in pop art, the population effect of antiretrovirals, they're basically going door to door to households with community-based workers who they call CHIPs, who are community HIV intervention practitioners or something like that. It's a community health worker, goes door to door, encouraging people, not forcing them, but encouraging people to undergo HIV testing. And those people who test negative are referred, men are referred on for circumcision and for other forms of prevention, and the positives are referred through to get treatment with antiretrovirals, and the different arms have slightly different arrangements of those packages to be able to tell over the next years what the impact at a community level, not at the individual level, but at the community level, the impact of antiretrovirals is. Antiretrovirals have also been shown to be useful directly in preventing HIV when used by people who are HIV negative. So the first study, again from Africa, from Durban, from the Caprisa group in KwaZulu-Natal, showed that tenofovir gel could be used to prevent HIV. Sadly, a much larger follow-up study, the FACT study across southern Africa, has failed to replicate this because of the challenges of adherence, that women don't always use this gel, and there are still therefore questions about how we might take this sort of work forward on microbicides. But subsequently, oral antiretrovirals given as pre-exposure prophylaxis, so being given to people who are HIV negative but at substantial risk of acquiring HIV, in this example because they were living in a discordant couple where one partner was positive and one partner was negative, and when the negative person is given antiretrovirals in couples in Kenya and Uganda, in a very big study of nearly 5,000 couples, there was a huge reduction in the acquisition of HIV. So a 2/3 or a 3/4 reduction in the incidence of HIV in people taking the active drug rather than placebo. Similarly, we've heard already, it was mentioned, the Rakai study, but I chose to show the first of the circumcision trials, which again came from South Africa, from Orange Farm, that the people who were circumcised, the men, HIV-negative men who were circumcised, were much less likely over the next 2 years, and the effect has actually been shown to continue, much less likely to acquire HIV. So science conducted in Africa has given us a whole range of different interventions that have allowed us to turn the tide on HIV as we were asked to do by the Millennium Development Goals, and we should celebrate that. And we now have a big range of proven, effective ways to prevent HIV, many of which arise from African science projects. Even more excitingly, well, no, it doesn't. I don't think it can be more exciting than that, actually. Equally exciting are the studies that show that giving antiretrovirals earlier in the course of infection definitely brings a benefit. So the Insight Start study that Pontiano mentioned, which had Uganda as one of the sites, and then Temprano, the study from Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa, and what this showed was that people were given either antiretrovirals at the recommendation of waiting until their CD4 count had fallen, or they were given more immediate antiretrovirals, whatever their CD4 count. So starting as soon as somebody was diagnosed, and they were also given isoniazid preventive therapy, either yes or no, as we mentioned in my very first slides, in a factorial design. And you can see that if you got no isoniazid and you deferred antiretrovirals, that you rapidly had severe adverse events, either death or severe illnesses, whereas if you had antiretroviral treatment, there was a significant reduction in those severe events, and indeed if you had isoniazid, either on its own or combined with antiretrovirals, you got significant benefit. So we could see in this individually randomized study that both strategies, giving isoniazid preventive therapy or giving antiretrovirals, or both, when people are diagnosed with HIV, is clearly and strongly beneficial. And these sorts of studies, but in particular the ones I've showed you, fed directly into the recommendations that WHO released last month, which they released early because they considered them to have such important public health impact. And they'll release the full guidelines at ICASA in Harare coming up, but they released these last month to give us all a push. And they say that any adult, and indeed it's also true for adolescents, when diagnosed with HIV, should straight away be initiated on antiretrovirals, regardless of their CD4 count. And they also say that pre-exposure prophylaxis, so antiretrovirals containing tenofovir, should be offered as an additional prevention choice for people who are at substantial risk of HIV. So like we heard of the fishing villages where 6% of people are getting HIV each year, you could stop that by offering those people, if you could find ways of delivering it and take it, you could stop that HIV infection in populations at high risk of HIV. This has also, of course, been achieved, the impacts we've had, because there's been a massive scaling up of funding, which we're aware of, and the good news is that that scale up in funding is both for the international funders in green, but very importantly for domestic funding, and domestic investment in HIV has gone up enormously over the Millennium Development Goal period, particularly for the BRICS and upper middle income countries, somewhat for the lower middle income countries, and then the low income countries, of course, it's much harder to scale up the investment. But we know now that many of the people living with HIV are actually living in middle income countries. There are more poor people living in middle income countries than there are living in low income countries. The world's economy is shifting and changing, and so it's encouraging to see countries like South Africa and Botswana, who have huge HIV epidemics, taking on a big share of the funding of the HIV response. So we move, and we've heard a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, some would say that we're already setting ourselves up to fail, but we believe that that's not the case, and that history has shown us that actually HIV is making enormous progress, and we're not now trying to reverse the trends, we're trying by 2030 to end the epidemic of AIDS, and many other things as well. And I'd like just to show you some of the challenges and tell you how we're going to get there. We know that now that we have the new WHO guidelines, less than half the people who actually need to be on antiretrovirals are taking them. So we may think we've achieved a lot, getting 15 million people on treatment, but we actually have 35 million people living with HIV, and they should all be on antiretrovirals in a perfect world. So that's a big challenge for us. And part of the challenge comes because many people do not know their HIV status. So many of those people living with HIV don't know that they're living with HIV, and changing the way that we provide and offer testing, normalising HIV testing, encouraging other people to be able to do HIV testing apart from doctors or nurses.